So I'm gonna present this one again, and Stefano will take some questions at the end. So I better make sure I get there in time. Can you all hear me all right? Yep, cool.
Yes.
Let me just enlarge that. So yeah, on the wrong slide. Yeah, so this is our update. The Auth technical specification group hasn't been around very long, and we've got a big problem, which I'll get onto in a moment. I'm just going to just briefly remind you about why the IIIF Auth spec is not an Auth spec in the sense of something like OAuth or CAS. Instead of it's this set of interaction patterns that let IIIF viewers understand whether you can see the things you're trying to look at. And if you can't, where to send you so that you could get access to them. And this is independent of the publisher's auth mechanisms. So people don't have to re-implement all their auth. They just layer the IIIF spec on top to allow viewers to interact with their auth. And this is based on these assumptions. You know, we don't want organizations to have to re-implement all their access control systems just so they can use IIIF. You might have a university-wide institutional single sign-on. Don't want something separate for your images. And we don't want to invent our own auth protocol either on top of, we don't want to have yet another auth protocol ourselves. We make the assumption that IIIF viewers, most of them anyway, are client-side JavaScript applications. And that, if I'm using Mirador on project.mirador.org and I'm looking at a protected resource on harvardartmuseums.org or anywhere else, that neither of these two parties need to tell the other about what they're going to be doing in advance. They don't need to come to some arrangement so that project.mirador.org is on a special list that Harvard has of allowed clients. We don't want that. And we also have to be aware that I can go to universalviewer.io, embed that on mysite.org, and then look at stuff on Harvard. So the code, the host site, and the assets are all on different domains, and none of them shouldn't have to know about each other. So that's our great kind of ideal. And when it works, it means that this content on welcome is offering click-through on welcome site, and it's also offering the same click-through auth on universalviewer.io, even though that's not its domain. That's ideal. That's what the auth spec did. Unfortunately, this has started to break, and this universalviewer.io example looking at welcome content doesn't work on Safari anymore and doesn't work in many versions of Chrome. And I used this slide last year. This is like the approaching train. The approaching train is even nearer and upon us in many browsers already. And it's the fact that the ability for browsers to send third-party cookies is slowly being withdrawn. Safari doesn't do that by default. You really have to go to great lengths to turn it on. There's a couple of articles here which I can provide links to, which kind of explain the problem. I won't go into in great detail now. But this problem, which is intended to combat tracking and privacy invading nasty commercial activities, is also breaking the auth spec. Because as we mentioned in the assumptions, you're almost always in a third-party context. And even if we change the auth spec completely so that the actual kind of handshake with the server work differently, we still need to send cookies to Harvard Art Museums to look at their stuff if it was protected. Now, increasingly browsers have begun to have been controlling and limiting the conditions in which you can use third-party cookies. So a few years ago, the same site attribute became required to do what we're trying to do, but that was okay, we could adapt. But now, Safari blocks third-party cookies, Chrome does. So, this idea that we want to avoid this, so we detect that someone can't see the image, so we send them to the login page, they come back, and then we show the image, and it's still broken. That's our problem. It's like, even though they've logged in, they're not going to send the cookies on our site, in our viewer, to Harvard Art Museums or wherever the publisher's content is. So what do we do about this? So we started to engage. So since the last conference, we've been engaging with the W3C privacy group. This is where all the browser makers hang out. This is where the Firefox team and the Chrome team and the Safari team talk about privacy implementations in browsers. Had quite a lot of engagement around our problem and understanding of our problem. A couple of months ago, Rob and I attended the W3C privacy group meeting and presented our problem there, and there was generally widespread understanding of what the problem was. We think that in extending the auth spec to include this storage access API, which is provided in Edge, Firefox, and Safari, does actually work and solve some of our problems. In fact, most of our problems. This is an API that allows you to ask the user whether they are permitted, whether they are going to allow cookies to be sent in a third-party context. So, in the same way that, you get like block notifications in a browser, so this client wants to allow third-party cookies to be sent. And this works. We did a few experiments. Again, I'll provide a link so you can experiment with this. This does work. If we extend the spec to include this, we can get it to work. But there's a problem there. That list of browsers did not include Chrome. Chrome doesn't want to do this. Chrome seemingly wants to implement a completely different thing called the Privacy Sandbox, which is a kind of opt-in model to deal with many, many commercial use cases. But those commercial use cases aren't our use cases. And so our kind of next challenge is to try and engage with Chrome, which we've been trying to do here. I'm still waiting for a response on this. And it may be the case that the Privacy Sandbox actually offers us all we need to implement this. But then we'd be faced with, here's the Chrome implementation of the auth spec, and here's the everyone else implementation of the auth spec, which would be bad. So yeah, this is our kind of problem at the moment. But we do believe that the storage access API is a way forward. Now, obviously, most content in the IIIF universe this doesn't affect it because it's not auth. This is only when you need to log in at the publisher so that your browser somewhere else can send cookies. So this is the interoperability auth use case. So the problem of that click-through not working on the welcome library, on the welcome site, was solved by moving the images and the viewer to the same domain. All third-party cookie issues go away. But in the interoperability environment, where I'm dealing with two archival resources that are both auth from different institutions, there's no way around that in all browsers, as far as we can see at the moment. But it's an ongoing thing. So assuming that we get past that, then the kind of work of a TSG will be a bit more conventional, like the search TSG will be aligning the spec with the JSON-LD 1.1 spec. We'll be looking at extending the model to support AV use cases, or rather any web resource, because at the moment the IIIF Auth spec deals with image services. But what about a static image, an audio file, a video file? And also, what about JSON-based resources that viewers load slightly differently from images and videos? Things like annotations, where you might have a set of annotations and they have different levels of access control. Here's one class's annotations, here's another class's annotations, differently protected. And yeah, we're still seeking out more and more auth use cases. And I think that's the most important thing. If you have auth use cases, there is a TSG just formed, which is us, and we want to hear them. Another one is considering how kind of, especially in the AV world where there's lots of token-based auth, there may be recipes that we need to come up with for how the auth spec works with those things. But I think that one is probably our biggest issue aside from the third-party cookie issue. And I guess the one problem here potentially is that whereas other TSGs and all the ones we've watched in the past can just go steady and slowly, getting consensus around everything, using people's time. There's a kind of bit of a kind of crucial window here, I think, with auth, where we need to put a lot of work in a short space of time while we have at least some attention of the browser vendors, so that we can work out a way to see if we can keep auth working the way it does. I'm gonna hand over, I'm gonna stop screen sharing and see if we have any questions about all that in the chat. I'll hand over to Stefano for that.
I'm not seeing any questions on the Whova chat.
Okay.
So people should feel free to type them into Whova if they have any.
I've lost my Whova window, so let me find it again.
Thanks, Tom. That was a very, very good summary of a very complicated problem that we've been working on for many months.
Robert, do you have a question? I just saw your hand raised.
Yeah, maybe just a technical question. These other solutions to third-party cookies, as I understand it, they're really not cookies. So would it require something? Does it require immediate JavaScript interpretation, or does it still work with an IMG tag and image resource like the old solution?
So I think I mischaracterized that slightly, actually. So the content storage, or sorry, the storage access API that Safari, Firefox, and Edge are implementing still supports third-party cookies, but they are very definitely things that you need to permit. You need to obviously permit. So it's still that mechanism that's been around for decades is still there with Firefox, Safari, and Edge. They're still third-party cookies. There's just this additional API on top for you to gain access to them. But Chrome's proposal is something else entirely, and it's more. Yeah, I mean, there's it's worth having a read of it, because I still don't really understand what they're proposing, and I don't think they have a complete picture of what they're proposing either. But it's basically a kind of opt-in model where use cases that support tracking and advertising funded web are the drivers of that work, not general access control scenarios that we've been using for cookies. So yeah, so the third-party cookie scenario still works in all those other browsers, but Chrome has a different approach, but its use cases don't intersect with our kind of cultural heritage use cases.
Yeah, so basically the dilemma is either supporting a solution that's supported by most major browsers except for one, or the solution that's adopted by one browser that holds maybe 70% of the share of web users. And or both of them, which will be like twice as much or more than twice as much work for us, because we don't only have to account for the two different specs, but also the possible discrepancies between the implementations that will be very, very complicated. One other, and this is a personal judgment on my side, but I'm sort of suspicious about the implementation of the privacy sandbox, because it is crafted around commercial needs, which are not inherently bad, but they are definitely very different from what our needs are. And these needs evolve very quickly, and they might evolve in a way that we can't keep pace with. So I guess the ideal solution for us would be to have some leverage within the Chrome developer base, and try to convince them to implement something that is commonly shared. But that's easier said than done.
I would just add to that, just to reinforce the point that this only applies to interoperable content when the software environment is not on the same domain as the publisher. So if you've got auth content, but it's on your own domain, that's fine. If you've got open content from all over the place, you can remix it to your heart's content, that's also fine. But it's that kind of perhaps archival research scenario where you're using Mirador and you're viewing content that needed you to log in from two different places at once, or in an annotation working workbench environment or something that lives on a different domain from the content. And I think if the absolute worst came to the worst, and that particular scenario wasn't working in Chrome but did work in every other browser, that would actually not be so bad. It wouldn't be the end of the world, because you are in a specialist tool environment and not just generally encountering stuff on the web in that scenario.
Yeah, I mean, it's already currently that when I go to my auth site, I have to switch on stop tracking or allow third-party cookies and things like that. So it already requires some involvement from the user, which the users in the special cases are okay to do, but still it's not the best of worlds.
Yeah. So yeah, that current scenario, it would be better if there wasn't that kind of, if the user interface of the viewer could actually prompt you for that kind of thing. It would be better that happened, but you had to use Safari, Edge, or Firefox. Then then it didn't work at all. That's actually better than today's scenario. Yeah, and I guess as Rob just points out in the chat there, we're kind of dealing with standards that are very much in flux. That won't be won't become technical recommendations for many years, perhaps. So that's both good in that they're not set in stone yet, and we can possibly, our small voice might possibly be heard, but also it's a kind of moving target for a long time. So what do we do in terms of a spec?
Yeah, I think in that sense, I mean, timing might be a critical issue, because now, as you said, Tom, is the time to kind of get the community to make that decision. But whether the storage API, well, we have to make sure that it gets on track, it doesn't get dropped along the way. But if there is the serious intention about that, then kind of time would be on our side, because there would be a development time and a development time for the specification. But the important thing, I think, is that everybody's on board.
Yeah. And as I said, our experiments do, I think, demonstrate that some tweaking of the current spec to accommodate interaction with the storage API does work. Yeah, we can carry on using the same pattern without the negative effects. So our search work, our auth work is kind of one big problem that might derail everything else, but then the regular kind of use case gathering and broadening the spec and updating the spec that would be expected of the version 2 of the spec technical specification group.
Yeah, and I mean also, I guess it's a very political issue in the sense of that it's not about the best solution, but it's about the question of who implements what and what gets how much leverage and things like that, which can pivot on factors that are completely out of our own control. So I would also see that, I mean, the W3C process is one thing, but browser vendors implementing something is a different process and is, well, I don't know, I didn't check the last things, but at least a few years back, those were completely separate processes. And
I guess they don't seem that separate to me. That the kind of W3C process is dominated by those browser vendors.
But usually they have something first and they have some agreement, and then they do the W3C stuff, or they may not, or or the W3C does something and then they ignore it. And
it's interesting to observe, at least. So but I'll just reiterate the call for use cases. Those, how do you interact with what kinds of scenarios? I'm thinking about things like virtual learning environments and platforms like that might want to make use of AV content and need to work out what the patterns are for reusing, especially AV content in those kind of contexts, and how does our pattern in our spec extend to that? That's our work, independently of the elephant in the room question.
Right, and even we have some maybe a few real use cases, not many, admittedly, but even if there are only a few, it's something that we need to implement in order to kind of maintain the philosophy of IIIF at the very least, because you cannot have resources that are outright blocked from from a IIIF viewer and with no workaround, right? So it might be a a good amount of work for a very small set of use cases. Probably they might grow, but it's more of a matter of compliance with the overall work that we are doing as a IIIF spec development.
I think time's up. Is that right, Meg?
Yes, it's me popping back up here.
Yeah. All right. Thanks, everyone. See you in the
Yeah,
next
thanks
one.
everyone. And if you want to continue the conversation again, I encourage you to use the little forum feature on Whova. All right.
Thank you.
Thanks all. Bye.
Right.